Greetings and welcome. It feels so strange that I'm not there in person myself to unveil my own book. I'm so sorry I cannot be there in person. Before I talk about the book and its evolution and the 50th anniversary, as well as where the discipline of consumer behavior is going to head for the next 50 years, I want to thank Dr. Chaturvedi and the Bimtech faculty for hosting the event. It is not easy at all to host any event, and therefore I really would like to thank them. I also would like to thank all the audience who has come, and also specifically Atul Parvatyar, V. Kumar, Jayant Shah, and Professor Shukla, who have gone out of their way to help out and create this event in the larger context of the doctoral consortium as well as the conference. And finally, I would like to thank Vikas Gupta, the chairman of John Wiley India, Anjali Chadha, and her team of people. It has been just a joy to work with John Wiley India. They've gone out of their way to help out and get the book out in time in 2019 to match the 50th anniversary of the book. Let me tell you the encounter with which I really got involved with the Howard theory of buyer behavior. Like many things in my life, whether you call it a destiny or blessings or divine intervention, this was another event where I became an accidental scholar. 1962, I was in the MBA program, second semester. There was an introductory marketing class taught by a professor, very well known. And he made a comment in the class that somewhere around 54% of the American housewives go to the grocery store without a shopping list, and therefore they are becoming more impulse buyers. I always sat in the front, very good student, typical Indian training. You never question your professor, and I was the only foreign student, not just the Indian student, in a class of about 70 students in a one-year MBA program. Something made me to raise my hand and ask a question. Professor, does this mean that all illiterate societies are impulse buyers? He was stunned. He backed off and he simply said, very good question. Let me think about it, etc. And then we just parted our way. That was John Howard, a very famous professor in marketing, and that encounter is the one that led me to work with him. My major at Pittsburgh for my doctorate, by the way, right after my MBA, one-year MBA, I decided to continue with my doctorate at University of Pittsburgh. My major was individual and group behavior, motivational side, psychological aspects, behavioral sciences. My minor was social psychology, and my applied field was marketing. I really was enamored with the leadership theories, what makes leaders so good in motivating others, inspiring others. And the professor I was working was Professor Bernard M. Bass, one of the giants in leadership. But I had to bring my fiancée to get married, and the amount of stipend they gave me as my doctoral assistantship was only $287.50. Minimum requirement to bring a dependent was $400. And I was looking around. John Howard said, I would like to work with you. You have an insight as a cross-cultural insight that I don't have. For example, he confided that he never thought about illiterate societies. And we started the journey in 1962. I first was tasked to revise his textbook, Marketing Management, second edition. It was the most popular MBA course. It was a managerial in orientation. What should a manager do rather than a description of what marketing is all about. Had some quantitative mathematical formulas, but he had a whole chapter devoted to consumer behavior and how consumers learn to become brand loyal. It was based upon Clark Hull, who was a top psychologist at Yale University, mostly experimental or what we call rat psychologist. And he had a theory, it is called stimulus response, SR. Basically, here is a stimulus, and how does the organism or the individual respond, mostly animals in this case, like the dogs, for example. And his theory had become very important to John Howard. It was a formula of four variables, and John saw a parallel of what Hull was doing in learning and experimental psychology to what was true in terms of consumer behavior. Right after we finished the revision of the book, and I did the instructor's manual, wrote a case called Spick and Span from Procter & Gamble, I suggested the idea that we should write a theory of buyer behavior more so than the chapter. By the time the whole discipline in psychology and behavioral sciences was getting away from SR model or the rat psychology to say there is something that mediates between the stimulus and response, it's called SOR model or organism, cognitive aspects. And I convinced John Howard that we should come out with an SOR framework. There's a black box between a stimulus, whether it's a marketing stimulus like advertising, price incentives, promotion, or a word of mouth stimulus, and before the consumer responds in terms of brand preference, brand choice, brand loyalty, there's a whole black box. And our job in theory building is to construct that black box and see how the stimulus mediates through variables in the black box. By that time, Clark Hull also was influenced by one of his colleagues who came to Yale. He was doing animal research at Yerkes primate research, mostly chimpanzee, monkey, etc. And his name was Kenneth Spence. And he also convinced Clark Hull that we need an SOR model, and that changed the world completely. The Howard-Seth theory is very complicated, but can be simplified very easily. The main tenet of the theory is that consumers don't make choices, which is the economic paradigm, but consumers reduce choices. And the process with which they reduce choices over time is through learning, through experience, and the feedback. Choice reduction is a very different approach than choice making. And we had two stages that consumers actually, first of all, reduce the choice set by what we call evoked set or consideration set, a few brands that are relevant, important to you from 50, 60 brands out there for detergents, toothpaste. And then within those 3, 4, 5 brands, they will make a final selection. In a paper I wrote with Atul Parvatyar, which has become a classic and multi-cited, very well published in JAMS, Relationship Marketing in Consumer Markets, we made the point that choice reduction is the ultimate thing what a consumer learns as a childhood. Parents guide the child what not to do. That is what they do. So brand choices start very early through socialization, later on at teenage level peer group influence, then the educational institutions, societal norms, the faith, and it's all about reducing the choices. So in Howard-Seth theory, we came out with a theory called psychology of simplification. As a consumer, you go through 3 phases, which John had already designed before. We incorporated that. Extensive problem solving, where you don't know what choices are or the criteria that you would use. Through learning and experience and the feedback, you become the criteria much more firm. You know what are the salient criteria, and then you begin to reduce the choices, go into what is called limited problem solving, and ultimately routinized response behavior or habit. Habit should have been the word. Howard wanted habit. I discouraged him because the word habit and SR model was out of favor in psychology, so we called it routinized response behavior. We added a very interesting twist that after a consumer becomes habituated, satiation comes in, there's an urge to explore. Exploration is a human trait very much like hunger. And there was a giant psychologist in Canada, I think at McGill University, Berlin, who had gone into exploratory behavior by humans. So we took many of his concepts and came out with the idea called psychology of complication. That you get bored, you get satiated, and you go out of your way, even though you are happy with the choice, to actually look for things that are new, different, etc., and ultimately come back to the same brand as before. There are only two constructs in Howard's theory. One is learning, which is the attitude as a measure of that learning over time, and the other one is perception. That any stimulus that comes is selectively exposed, selectively attended, there is a selective retention, and there is a selective response. So we came out with two boxes, a perceptual bias box and a learning box, which is basically attitude. And the model was created. We got a bunch of external factors because the model is dynamic over time and it is very contextual. So we came out with many what economists would call as exogenous variables. With purchase leading up to satisfaction, satisfaction leading up to changing the cognitive structure, all this thing came out and it became a very comprehensive theory. The theory made an enormous impact. Timing was right. The world was looking for a new area to focus on in marketing. Consumer behavior was a part of market research at that time. But there were people who wanted to primarily focus on CB for its own sake, and people in psychology and public policy wanted to think about that. We had President John Kennedy who came out with the Bill of Rights of Consumers, for example. There was a lot of sentiment about consumerism, anti-marketing sentiment, which led to the spawning of a whole new discipline. Actually, timing was very right, as I mentioned, and therefore it just took off. I was heavily involved in the formation of Association for Consumer Research at Ohio State at a workshop on consumer behavior, organized by Jim Engel, who really is the pioneer in creating institutional approach to the consumer behavior discipline. ACR became a top organization, and at the 50th anniversary of the first conference held in Atlanta, there were 1,200 delegates, mostly young scholars, significant percentage coming from foreign countries, especially continental Europe and Germany, but lots of young women scholars. It's so exciting that women scholars worldwide are very interested in the CB field. That ACR started a journal called JCR that became a very important first-tier journal in consumer behavior. And over time, consumer behavior has evolved, diversing itself from market research into several phases. First one was multi-attribute analysis. Attitudes is a composite of multiple characteristics or criteria. That morphed into information processing. Information processing led to ultimately biometric things like pupil dilation, galvanic skin pressure. I did a lot of experiments using tachistoscope, flashing a slide or a stimulus at below the threshold level of 1/60th per second, about 1/50th per second, which is all about subliminal advertising. Did very fascinating research for companies as well as for my own curiosity. Biological or biometric sciences gave way to what is called Odyssey research. Notion was that the consumer behavior is so complex that unless you live and breathe in that environment like anthropologists do, you will never get a holistic picture. It'd be like touching 5 blind men touching the elephant, each one having different interpretations. So one needs to immerse into that one, led by Russ Belk, and it became a major trend in consumer behavior. That gave way to motivation research. Motivation research actually came earlier. What are the hidden persuaders? Freud's influence. And Ernest Dichter was the leader, a practitioner actually, but he did a fantastic set of research and published all kinds of things what we would call today as irrational behavior or behavioral economics. Ultimately, the discipline now has gone into what one calls experimental psychology, social psychology. You carry out experiments in the laboratory or online, study one, study two, study three, change one more variable, see what happens, and that is the main trend today. In fact, most JCR papers are typically what I call study one, study two, study three papers. Before I talk about the future of consumer behavior, I do want to go back to John Howard. He probably was one of the best mentors one could ever have. Not only he was a top scholar in his own right, a great educator, absolutely dedicated to the discipline. He was given, I think, 2 years leave of absence, fully paid by Ford Foundation, to think about how marketing can become much more a rigorous discipline, not just a descriptive phenomenon. And his book, Marketing Theory, which summarized how behavioral sciences and quantitative sciences must become a part of marketing curriculum and a broader context business curriculum, is still a classic book. So I was blessed, I was fortunate that through sheer coincidence in that class encounter, I became his co-author. We worked very well. A lot of confrontation. He never treated me as if I'm his subordinate. I must do what he wants me to do. Gave me the freedom to think on my own. I went to Columbia University with him in 1963 before finishing my doctorate because he went to Columbia, he wanted me to go, and for 2 years in the Columbia Library stacks, I did nothing but just wander around. And I realized my knowledge suddenly had a step function, and most of that was incorporated into constructing the Howard theory. Project that began in 1962 finally got published in 1969. John was such a great mentor that he went ahead to Columbia University in New York, rented the apartment for me in his name, giving the guarantee. All I had to do in October to come there, and it's mind-boggling to see how much of a benevolent person he was. So the book, The Howard Theory of Buyer Behavior, I have dedicated to John Howard. He just was a great mentor to many, many people, following me to George Day, for example, at Columbia, and many others. The book has got the sentiment about John Howard from 5, 6 people who knew him very intimately, closely. And my own dedication to the book is to John Howard. He will go down in the history as one of the probably major influencers in the history and the evolution of marketing. Now let me talk about the future of consumer behavior. The next 50 years in consumer behavior will be even more bright or brighter, and I wish I would live through that. There are 6, 7 areas in which consumer behavior will change dramatically, giving more opportunities, in fact, to young scholars. The first major one is rise of emerging markets and the consumer behavior in emerging markets, because China will become the largest consumer market, surpassing America. India will become the second or the third largest market because of the population size. And they're all changing their whole consumption patterns from the traditional society to more modern society or contemporary society. E-commerce is here, lots of data are there. So emerging market consumers will become the focal point going forward. Related to that one is that there's so much of data available because of cell phone technology, which has become egalitarian or democratic. Everybody has a cell phone, smartphone today. We buy so much of online. We have all kinds of ratings and feedback and user things. So all of that will generate enormous amount of data analytics. If there is any one future where India can do very well out of India, is to immediately go into using Indian data and do analytics on that one and publish in the top journals. As K. Sudhir does from Yale University, using Indian data, analyzing them, contextualizing properly into the top marketing journal called Marketing Science or Journal of Marketing Research. Anybody can do it. The third area, surprisingly, is going to be separation of the user from the buyer. Hardship theory was the theory of buying behavior. Focus was on the seller-buyer interaction, like typically in a bazaar or in a shopping mall, primarily for fast-moving consumer goods or FMCG goods, repetitious buying. Today, user is different than the buyer. You have three roles: a user, payer, and a buyer. Most of the research today is on user experience. And for the first time, marketing and selling will divorce, because marketing talked about buyer, which is the same as a selling proposition. But now marketing focusing on user, I think, is a clear demarcation between marketing and selling. Next area, and I think it's very, very rising, is what I have called mindful consumption. The whole environmental issue is very serious and real, but it cannot be stopped on the supply side, which is where the policy guys are focusing. Ultimately, it's the consumption side that we need to focus. And what can we do, either by policy, by banning, for example, or motivating in some fashion, or by market process? How do you make consumers mindful of their consumption? Not just recycle, reuse, and reduce consumption, but just being consciousness. It works. The paper I have in Journal of Academy of Marketing Science, JAMS, on mindful consumption as an academic paper has received good receptivity. I think mindful consumption is a major area of research opportunity in CB as we go forward. There is also consumption of free goods. There are more free goods today than ever before. So how do we have no theories of free goods. In the old days, the free goods used to be, of course, parks and recreations, museums, something that are funded by foundations, like a Getty Museum, for example, Rockefeller Museums, whatever they are. But the biggest free goods today are all technology-based. Most apps are free. Many of the technology platforms sometimes are free. Social media mostly begin free, whether it's a Facebook, WhatsApp, WeChat, whatever they are. We really need to understand the psychology and the economics of free goods, because economics of free goods through economic literature is price anchored. There's no theory about free goods. So there's a big area in consumer behavior. One more area has to do with virtual consumption. More and more consumers are finding more comfort and more satisfaction being in virtual communities. In other words, the digital world is more exciting than the physical world. And in this particular case, two communities which are virtual, Second Life, for example, and Farmville, is fascinating. People are creating the digital avatars. They actually virtually see themselves differently in the digital world. They collect digital possessions like we used to collect baseball cards or whatever they are, toys, etc. So we need to understand consumer behavior in the digital world. And the last area, and the one that I've been very fascinated, is why consumption varies from country to country, culture to culture. Why North India has paneer as a major diet and South India has conspicuous absence of paneer. Northern India is basically more saturated fat through dairy products, animal. South India is all based upon plant-based. Olive oil, coconut oil, palm oil take over. Worldwide, that's true. We have studied cultural differences east-west because of the British Empire and the influence, and writers like the key writer who wrote about East is East and the West is West, Rudyard Kipling. But we have not studied north-south differences. In my book, Gene, Climate and Culture Consumption, I learned a lot, and I'm very strongly of the belief that while anthropologists have typology and classifications or attributes of cultures, they don't have an explanation. Why cultures vary in their food habits, in their clothing, in their shelter, or in time punctuality, uncertainty avoidance, whatever cultural traits are. I think it's going to become a mainstream research in consumer behavior. So next 50 years of consumer behavior are more exciting actually than the last 50 years in some fashion. Thank you, and I again want to thank Bimtech, Dr. Chaturvedi, the faculty for hosting this event. Thank you.